14-year-old girls were not supposed to read tide tables. They were not supposed to know that one rusted iron pen hidden inside a rice gate wheel could erase the only dry road out of a plantation for 6 hours. And they were certainly not supposed to make 212 people disappear before sunrise. But on Cinder Marsh, two identical faces had spent 9 months watching the water. This is a dramatized historical story. The people in the state are fictional, but the world around them, the tidal rice fields, the patrol system, the forced labor, and the organized resistance is grounded in the documented realities of slavery in the coastal South. The twins were named Miriam and Eliza Bell. They were 14 years old, small enough to be ignored, quiet enough to be trusted, and identical enough that the Voss family never bothered learning which girl was which. That mistake would cost them an entire plantation. Cinder Marsh sat along the South Carolina coast, several miles inland from Port Royal Sound. It covered nearly 1,800 acres, most of it carved into flooded rice fields by dikes, canals, and wooden trunk gates that controlled the tide. The place looked like land. It was really a machine built out of water. At low tide, the canals drained. At high tide, the gates admitted salt-heavy river water into the fields. Every crop depended on timing. Every wagon road depended on elevation. Every patrol route depended on the same assumption. The water would stay where the owners told it to stay. Nathaniel Voss believed that assumption because he owned the gates. He was 48, rich, methodical, and proud of the fact that his rice yields had risen for 5 straight years. He kept ledgers on everything: seed, tools, barrels, births, deaths, punishments, losses. He had 6 mounted watchmen, 2 kennel hands, 9 bloodhounds, and an overseer named Caleb Rusk, who treated terror like a form of accounting. Rusk did not shout often. He preferred to speak softly before he hurt someone. That made him worse. Miriam and Eliza arrived at Cinder Marsh in November of 1857, purchased from a dealer in Charleston with 21 other people. The sale paper listed them as twin girls, house-trained, healthy, no known defects, no parents, no birthplace, no history, just our pride. Mrs. Voss assigned them to the main house because they could sew, carry trays, polish silver, and move without being heard. Within 2 weeks, they knew which floorboards creaked. Within a month, they knew where Nathaniel kept his keys. By New Year's, they could identify every watchman by the rhythm of his horse. Miriam noticed patterns first. Eliza noticed what broke them. Together, they remembered almost everything. They knew the North Patrol stopped behind the smokehouse at 10 each night because the rider drank from a hidden flask. They knew the kennel dogs became restless 20 minutes before the tide turned because the wind changed over the marsh. They knew Rusk checked the field quarters at 9, the stables at 9:30, and the east dike at 10:15, unless rain softened the road. And they knew the great rice gate wheel near the eastern causeway had one damaged locking pin. A blacksmith had repaired it badly years earlier. The pin held under ordinary pressure. But during a spring tide, when river water climbed against the gate, the whole mechanism trembled hard enough to shake dust from the housing. One missing pin would not open the gate, but it would make the wheel turn. And if the wheel turned far enough, the eastern canal would rise over the road. The twins learned that in silence. They made their decision because of a woman named Mara. Mara was 19, 6 months pregnant, and assigned to the harvest gang despite a fever that left her shaking. On January 22, Rusk ordered the gang into knee-deep water before sunrise. By noon, Mara could no longer stand. She fell beside a cut bank, one hand pressed to her stomach. Rusk looked at her, then at the unfinished row. Production does not stop for weakness, he said. He ordered 2 workers to drag her to the shade and leave her there until the bell. She begged for the midwife. Rusk refused. Miriam and Eliza were carrying drinking water from the kitchen. They saw Mara's lips turn gray. They saw her body fold around the child she was trying to protect. They saw Celia, the plantation midwife, forced to wait 3 hours before she was allowed to help. The baby came too early that night and never cried. Mara survived. Something inside the twins did not. That evening, in a narrow attic space above the laundry, Eliza whispered, "We could poison him." Miriam stared at the rafters. One man, Rusk first, and the next overseer. Eliza said nothing. Miriam turned toward her sister in the darkness. "We do not need one man gone. We need the road gone." That was the beginning, not of a rebellion, not of revenge, of an evacuation. 212 people lived under forced labor at Cinder Marsh. 43 were children under 10. 19 were over 60. More than 30 carried injuries that made 8 miles on foot impossible. The estate was surrounded by wet fields, tidal creeks, and patrol roads. Any route toward legal freedom stretched hundreds of miles. A simple escape might save 2 people. Miriam and Eliza wanted to move everyone who chose to go. At first, the idea sounded like madness even to them. Then they began to break it into parts. Part 1, information. Part 2, trust. Part 3, transport. Part 4, time. Part 5, water. They already had the information. Trust was harder. Their first ally was Jonah Reed, a 50-year-old boatman who ferried rice barrels between the estate landing and coastal warehouses. Before Cinder Marsh, he had worked aboard shallow draft schooners. He knew every tidal creek from Beaufort to St. Helena Sound, including channels that disappeared into reeds at low water. Miriam approached him while delivering food to the landing. "How many people can a rice flat carry?" she asked. Jonah kept coiling rope. "Depends who is asking." "How many without sinking?" His hands stopped. He looked at the girl, then at Eliza, standing 10 yards away with an empty basket. 40, if the water is calm. "What about 6 flats?" Jonah's face changed. Not fear, recognition. He had spent most of his life waiting for someone to ask a question large enough to matter. 6 flats could carry more than 200, he said. "But you would need poles, oars, men who know the channels, and darkness deep enough to hide a church." Miriam nodded. "We can arrange the darkness." The second ally was Isaac Green, the plantation carpenter. Isaac maintained the rice gates, wagon bridges, and drainage trunks. He understood how water pressure traveled through the system. He also knew the damaged pin in the east wheel. When the twins showed him their plan, he rejected it immediately. "You open that gate at the wrong hour, you drown the lower field." "We are not opening it at the wrong hour," Eliza said. "There is no right hour for flooding a causeway. There is if no one is standing on it." Isaac studied the rough map Miriam had scratched into a board with charcoal. It showed the East Canal, the causeway, the patrol path, the landing, and 3 narrow creeks that curved through marsh grass toward the sound. "You drew this from memory?" Miriam wiped the map away with her sleeve. "We do not keep paper." Isaac looked toward the door. "What happens after the road floods?" "The mounted patrol cannot reach the landing," Eliza said. "The dogs cannot hold scent through tidal water. The estate bell brings every white man toward the dike. While they are watching the road disappear, the flats leave through back Heron Creek. Isaac's jaw tightened. You would need the spring tide. We know. You would need the wheel unguarded. We know. You would need the pin out before the pressure rises. We know. And if the gate jams halfway, Miriam met his eyes. Then one of us stays and turns it by hand. Isaac had no answer for that. By February, the twins had a core group of 8. Jonah, the boatman. Isaac, the carpenter. Celia, the midwife. Esther, the cook. Moses Clay, a cooper with shoulders strong enough to move a rice flat alone. Lydia Cross, who worked in the laundry and heard everything spoken in the main house. Samuel, a field driver who had earned trust without surrendering loyalty. And old Ben, who had been at Cinder Marsh longer than Nathaniel Voss had been alive. Each person knew only what they needed. Jonah acquired oars one at a time, claiming replacements were needed at the landing. Isaac shaved new wooden pins and hid them beneath a floor plank in the carpenter's shed. Esther dried corn cakes and saltfish in amounts too small to affect the kitchen count. Celia identified who could walk, who needed carrying, who needed medicine, and which children might cry under pressure. Lydia learned the household calendar. Samuel divided the quarters into 5 traveling groups. Ben watched people. That was his task. He watched for fear, loose talk, jealousy, and the kind of despair that could turn a person into an informant. The twins built the plan the way Cinder Marsh had been built, one controlled channel at a time. March brought the first problem. Nathaniel Voss hired a new patrol captain named Silas Brune. Brune had worked on 3 estates and left each one with a reputation for finding runaways before sunrise. He changed the patrol routes without warning. He moved the dogs. He ordered random head counts after midnight. The predictable system became unstable. Eliza wanted to move the date forward. Miriam refused. Unstable does not mean unknowable, she said. It means we need a new pattern. For 19 nights, the twins tracked Brune's decisions. He varied the routes, but not his habits. He always began where the last problem had occurred. He always checked the dogs himself. He always returned to the same warming fire between midnight and 1. He believed unpredictability made him invisible. It only made him proud. By April, the twins had learned how to guide that pride. When they wanted Brune near the stables, Lydia let him overhear a rumor about missing tack. When they wanted him away from the East Dike, Esther reported rats in the grain room. When they wanted the dogs moved north, Samuel arranged for a pig to break through a fence and leave a strong trail. They never ordered Brune. They gave him reasons to order himself. Then came the cost. One evening in May, Brune discovered a coil of boat rope hidden beneath the landing steps. The rope belonged to the plan. If he traced it back to Jonah, the entire network could collapse. Brune locked down the estate. He searched the boat shed, the quarters, the forge, and the kitchen stores. He questioned 6 men before midnight. By dawn, he had Jonah tied to a post near the landing. No one spoke. At breakfast, Miriam heard Nathaniel tell Brune, "Make an example before noon." She carried the coffee without spilling a drop. In the pantry, Eliza asked the only question that mattered. "Can we get him out?" "No." "Can we move tonight?" "No." "Then what?" Miriam looked toward the dining room, where Nathaniel was discussing rope theft as though it were damaged merchandise. "We give Brune a better answer." The twins found old Ben behind the smokehouse. Ben listened without interrupting. When Miriam finished, he leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. "How many know the full plan?" he asked. 10. How many leave if Jonah breaks? None. Ben nodded. Then he said, put the answer in my cabin. Eliza stared at him. No, I am 71 years old. No, I have buried 2 wives, 4 children, and enough friends to fill that marsh. Do not waste time pretending my back is worth more than 200 lives. Miriam's voice went flat. You could die. So could Jonah. Difference is, Jonah knows the water. Ben opened his eyes. You girls are building a door. Somebody has to hold it open. That afternoon, Broom found a second coil of rope, 2 stolen hooks, and a small bag of dry food beneath Ben's sleeping platform. Ben confessed before Broom finished asking. He said he had planned to steal a skiff and run alone. The story made sense because it was small. Owners believed in small desperation. They understood a single old man trying to flee. What they could not imagine was organization. Jonah was released. Ben was whipped. The twins stood in the back row of the yard while it happened. Each strike landed on Ben's back. Each one landed somewhere inside them. Later, Celia cleaned his wounds. Eliza sat beside him, unable to speak. Ben opened one swollen eye. Do not make that face. We did this, she whispered. No, they did this. You used the shape of what they already were. That does not make it clean. Freedom has never been clean. He reached for her hand. Make it worth the blood. That night, Eliza cried for the first time since arriving at Cinder Marsh. Miriam did not tell her to stop. The plan survived, but it changed. Until then, the twins had thought success meant precision without loss. After Ben, they understood the truth. A plan could be necessary and still leave scars. A good outcome could still demand something cruel. And the person making the choice might never be able to call herself innocent again. June hardened the estate. Broom doubled the patrols. Nathaniel bought 2 more dogs. The summer heat brought fever. 3 children died in the quarters before July. Mara, still weak from the winter, asked Miriam when the plan would happen. Soon. You have said soon for months. Because months are what it costs. Mara studied her. And if the cost keeps rising? Miriam looked across the flooded fields. Sunlight flashed on the water like broken glass. Then we stopped counting what it costs us. She turned toward the quarters. And start counting what it costs to stay. The date was set for August 31, 1858. A spring tide would peak shortly after midnight. The moon would be a thin crescent. Jonah expected a coastal storm to arrive from the southeast. Not a hurricane, just hard wind, rain, and enough thunder to bury the sound of wood against wood. The plan required 5 moving parts. At 9:30, Lydia would place a false message in Nathaniel's study claiming rice thieves had been seen near the north warehouse. At 10, Broom would lead mounted men north. At 10:15, Isaac would remove the damaged iron pin from the east gate wheel and replace it with a shaved wooden plug. At 11:30, rising pressure would split the plug and begin opening the gate. At midnight, the eastern canal would spill across the causeway, cutting the landing off from the main house. During the confusion, 212 people would leave the quarters in 5 groups and move through separate drainage paths to 6 hidden rice flats. No torches, no wagons, no shouted signals. The estate bell would ring 3 times if the road flooded correctly, 2 times if the gate failed, 1 continuous alarm if the plan was discovered. The boats would travel 11 miles through Back Heron Creek, cross a wide tidal reach before dawn, and enter a maze of islands where Jonah had arranged help from free black fishermen and members of a covert resistance network. After that, the group would split. Some would continue north by water. Some would hide in coastal communities. Some would take inland routes through covert networks, though safety was never guaranteed. The plan did not promise freedom. It promised a chance. For people at Cinder Marsh, that was enough. The final week arrived. Every sound felt louder. Every glance felt dangerous. The twins continued serving meals, folding linens, cleaning soot from lamps, and standing behind chairs while Nathaniel talked about yields. 212 people prepared to vanish around him. He noticed nothing. Then, 3 days before the escape, the storm changed direction. Jonah saw it first. The wind came east instead of southeast. The clouds thinned. The pressure rose. The storm will pass below us, he told the twins. Maybe rain. No thunder. Without thunder, every boat launch could be heard from the landing. Without hard wind, the rice flats would move slower. Without cloud cover, even a thin moon might expose the channels. Eliza wanted to postpone. This time, Miriam did too. Then Lydia brought news from the main house. Nathaniel had agreed to sell 37 people on September 2. A trader from Charleston would arrive with wagons. Families would be separated. The network would be broken. There would be no second date. Miriam closed her eyes. No storm, Jonah said. More patrols. A sail in 2 days. We cannot carry children quietly through open marsh under a clear sky. Eliza looked at her sister. For 9 months, Miriam had always found another way. Now she said nothing. That silence frightened everyone more than a bad answer. Old Ben, still scarred from May, leaned on a cane near the carpenter shed. What does the water say? He asked. Isaac answered. The spring tide still comes, then the road still disappears. The boats will be heard, Jonah said. Ben looked toward the main house. Only if somebody is listening. Miriam opened her eyes. The plan changed for the last time. They did not need thunder. They needed every armed man on the estate facing the wrong direction. Cinder Marsh had one warning bell mounted beside the rice mill. 3 fast rings meant fire. A long rolling sequence meant a dike break, the nightmare every rice planter feared. A major breach could destroy a season's crop in minutes. At 11:45, instead of waiting for the gate to open quietly, Miriam and Eliza would ring the dike alarm. Every overseer, watchman, and able-bodied white worker would run east to save the fields. At the same moment, Isaac would drive the gate wheel open. The alarm would be true. The causeway would flood. And while the estate fought its own water, the flats would launch from the west landing. The adjustment solved the noise problem. It created another. The twins would have to remain at the bell until the last group was moving. By then, the road between them and the boats could be underwater. You will be trapped, Eliza said. Miriam looked at her. We will both be trapped. No, one rings, one leaves. We do not split. We may have to. For the first time, the plan threatened the only thing the twins had never considered sacrificing, each other. August 31 arrived hot and windless. The sky stayed clear. At breakfast, Nathaniel complained about the humidity. At noon, Brune inspected the east dike. At 4, the Charleston trader sent a messenger confirming he would arrive in 2 days. At 6, the field bell ended labor. At 7, Esther served supper. At 8, Celia moved the youngest children into houses closest to the drainage paths. At 9, Jonah checked the rice flats for the last time. At 9:30, Lydia slipped the false theft message beneath Nathaniel's study door. At 9:40, Broom found it. At 9:50, he saddled 3 riders and rode north. The first piece moved. At 10:15, Isaac reached the east gate. He removed the iron pin. He inserted the shaved wooden plug. He returned to the carpenter's shed and waited. At 10:30, the quarters went dark. Not empty. Waiting. 212 people sat in silence with food bundles, children, medicine, and nothing they could not carry. At 11, the tide began to press inland. The canal level rose. At 11:20, the east wheel shuddered. At 11:30, the wooden plug bent. At 11:35, it cracked, but did not break. Isaac heard the failure through the gate housing. He ran to the mill and found the twins. The plug is jammed. Miriam's face did not change. How long until peak pressure? 20 minutes. Can you pull it? Not with the wheel loaded. It has to be cut out from inside the housing. Eliza looked toward the dark causeway. If the gate does not open, Brune rides back across dry ground. If we ring the alarm before the water rises, they will know it is false, Isaac said. Miriam picked up the short iron hammer beside the bell frame. Then we make it true. They reached the gate at 11:40. Water pressed against the timber doors hard enough to make them groan. Isaac opened the housing panel. The broken wooden plug had wedged behind the locking plate. He pushed in a chisel. The chisel snapped. 11:43. From the north road came the faint sound of horses. Brune was returning early. Eliza climbed onto the wheel platform. Tell me where to strike, Isaac pointed. Behind the plate. But if it gives, the wheel will spin. How fast? Fast enough to break your arm. Miriam grabbed her sister's waist. Eliza raised the hammer. The first blow split the wood. The second moved the plate. The third shattered the plug. The wheel tore free. Eliza's hand slipped. For 1 second, the spoke caught her sleeve and pulled her toward the turning machinery. Miriam yanked backward. Cloth ripped. The wheel spun. The gate opened. River water exploded through the trunk, slammed into the eastern canal, and raced toward the causeway. Isaac stared at the rising current. Go! The twins ran for the mill. At 11:47, Miriam seized the bell rope. One long roll, then another, then another. The sound tore across Cinder Marsh. Doors opened at the main house. Lanterns appeared. Men shouted. Nathaniel Voss ran into the yard without a coat. Dike break! The words every planter feared. Every available man moved east. Watchmen abandoned the kennels. Stable hands brought horses. Brune galloped toward the bell, saw water crossing the road, and turned his riders toward the dike. No one looked west. At 11:50, Samuel opened the first quarter door. Group 1 moved. 38 people followed a drainage path through waist-high grass. At 11:54, Group 2 left. At 11:58, Group 3. Children were carried beneath blankets to muffle sound. Older people leaned on poles. Celia moved beside Mara, one arm around her waist. Ben refused to be carried. Save your strength for someone young, he said. At midnight, the first rice flat slid from the west landing. No thunder covered it. The warning bell did. At 12:03, Nathaniel reached the flooded causeway and found the eastern canal rising over the road. Close the gate, he shouted. Isaac stood beside him, soaked to the waist, pretending to fight the wheel he had helped open. It is jammed. Cut the chain. There is no chain. Then stop the water. Nathaniel's world had been built on that command. Stop the water. He had ordered people, crops, accounts, bodies, births, deaths. Now the tide ignored him. At the mill, Miriam counted the bell strokes. Eliza watched the west path. A child appeared first, running back toward them. He was 6 years old, barefoot, crying without sound. Eliza caught him. Where is your group? He pointed toward the laundry. My mother fell. The twins looked at each other. The last boat would leave in minutes. Miriam took the child. Go, she told Eliza. No, find his mother. We said we do not split. We also said everyone who chooses to go gets a chance. Eliza hesitated 1 second, then ran. Miriam kept ringing. 12:08. The fourth flat launched. 12:11. Eliza found the boy's mother. Ruthie collapsed near a drainage ditch with a twisted ankle. 2 other women had stayed with her. Eliza pulled Ruthie upright. We cannot carry her fast enough, one woman said. You do not have to. Eliza pointed toward a narrow plank used by laundry workers to cross the ditch. Together, they laid Ruthie on it and dragged her like a sled through the grass. 12:14. The fifth flat launched. Jonah stood at the west landing, scanning the darkness. Where are the twins? Samuel looked toward the bell, still ringing. Where is the child? Not here. Jonah's face hardened. Hold the last flat. 12:16. The canal covered the causeway completely. Brune sent one rider west to check the quarters. The rider crossed the main yard. Miriam saw his lantern moving. She stopped ringing. The sudden silence felt larger than the bell. The rider slowed. He had expected panic. Instead, the estate had gone strangely still. Miriam carried the child into the mill and lowered him behind a grain bin. Do not move until I come back. She stepped outside. The rider recognized her from the main house. You, he called. Where is everyone? Miriam pointed east. At the dike, sir. All of them? Yes, sir. He looked toward the dark quarters, then toward the flooded road. He had 2 choices: investigate the silence or obey the emergency. Miriam dropped her eyes. The posture of a frightened child. The rider turned east. Assumptions saved them again. 12:19. Eliza reached the mill dragging Ruthie with the 2 women. Miriam lifted the boy. No words. They ran west. Behind them, Nathaniel ordered men to build a barrier from rice sacks. Brune cursed the water. Lanterns gathered at the wrong edge of the estate. Ahead, the last flat waited. Then the dogs began barking. The kennel hands had returned. A hound caught scent near the quarters and pulled west. Brune heard it. His head turned. Check the landing. 3 men started across the yard. The twins were 400 yards from the boats. Ruthie could no longer stand. The plank caught in mud. The child cried out. At the landing, Jonah raised his pole. Now, Samuel and Moses ran from the reeds. They lifted Ruthie between them and carried her. Miriam shoved the child into the flat. Eliza climbed after him. Behind them, lantern light broke through the grass. A shot cracked across the marsh. The ball struck the landing post. Jonah pushed. The flat did not move. It had settled into mud while waiting. Moses jumped into the water, braced both hands against the hull, and heaved. Nothing. The patrol light came closer. A dog barked less than 100 yards away. Miriam jumped beside Moses, then Eliza, then Samuel. 4 bodies pushed against the heavy flat, while 211 people moved through darkness ahead of them. The hull shifted 1 inch. Another shot. Water splashed beside Eliza's shoulder. Again, Miriam said. They pushed. The flat broke free. Jonah hauled the twins aboard by their arms. Samuel climbed after them. Moses remained waist deep for 1 second, shoving the stern toward the current, then caught the gunwale and rolled inside as the flat slid beyond the reeds. The patrol reached the landing. Too late. 6 rice flats had entered Back Heron Creek. No lamps, no voices, only poles dipping into black water. The dogs lost the scent at the shoreline. Brune fired again, but the dark swallowed the shot. For the first mile, no one spoke. The creek narrowed until marsh grass brushed both sides of the flats. Jonah, guided by stars, current, and the feel of the pole against the bottom. Every turn looked identical. Every bank seemed to close behind them. At 1:15, they reached the tidal reach. Open water, no cover. The 6 flats had to cross nearly half a mile before entering the island channels. A wind rose from the south. Not the storm they had wanted, just enough to roughen the surface. Jonah looked back at the faint glow of Cinder Marsh. "Spread the boats," he whispered. "If one is seen, the others keep moving." The flats separated. Miriam held the 6-year-old boy against her chest. Eliza sat beside Ruthie, pressing cloth around the swollen ankle. Old Ben lay near the bow, feverish from the journey, but awake. He looked at the twins. Did the door hold? Miriam looked across the water at the other boats, dark shapes carrying families, elders, children, people whose names Nathaniel Voss had reduced to columns. "Yes," she said. Ben smiled. "Then make it worth the blood." At 2:30, the first flat entered the island reeds. At 3:10, all 6 were accounted for. 212 people had left Cinder Marsh. 212 were still alive. The journey beyond the islands would be longer, more dangerous, and impossible to guarantee. Some would find help in coastal communities. Some would be hidden aboard vessels. Some would travel north in small groups. Some might be caught. The twins knew that freedom was not a place reached in one night. It was a chain of people willing to risk themselves for someone they might never meet. At dawn, Cinder Marsh was still fighting the tide. The eastern causeway lay under 3 feet of water. Rice sacks floated in the canal. The kennel dogs circled the west landing, whining at a trail that ended in black mud. Nathaniel entered the quarters and found every room empty. 212 sleeping spaces, 212 absences, no bodies, no battle, no rebellion he could crush. Just a system that had failed because the people inside it understood the system better than the man who claimed to own it. Broom searched the mill. He found the broken wooden plug. He found Eliza's torn sleeve caught in the wheel. He found 2 sets of small footprints in the wet boards beside the warning bell. Only then did the truth begin to form. The quiet girls in the main house had not been invisible. They had been studying him. Every changed route, every kennel order, every proud correction. He had spent months believing he was making the estate harder to escape. He had been teaching them exactly how he thought. That was the part Nathaniel Voss could never accept. Not that 212 people had left, not that the rice crop was damaged, not that 6 boats had vanished into the marsh, but that 2 14-year-old girls had looked at his gates, his riders, his dogs, his ledgers, and his authority, and seen nothing supernatural. Only habits, only pressure points, only a machine built by human hands. And anything built by human hands could be understood. Anything understood could be changed. By noon, the tide began to fall. The causeway slowly reappeared beneath the water, but the people did not. The road came back. The plantation never did.